The moment we turned onto that stretch of highway, something changed in the air. A heaviness descended, like the atmosphere itself had thickened with dread. The road stretched before us, a ribbon of cracked asphalt cutting through dense forest that seemed to lean inward, watching our progress. Even before we saw the cabin, I felt it, that crawling sensation up my spine, warning me that something wasn't right. Mike drove while I dozed, the rhythmic hum of tires on pavement lulling me in and out of consciousness. We were heading to a weekend retreat, a much-needed break from the suffocating routine of office life. The late afternoon sun filtered through the trees in broken shafts, creating strange patterns that danced across the dashboard. I remember thinking how beautiful it looked, right before everything went wrong. "Hey, check that out," Mike said, his voice cutting through my haze. I blinked awake, following his gaze to the side of the road where a small dirt path veered into the woods. At its entrance stood a weathered sign, hand-painted in red letters that had begun to drip down the wood. "Help needed." My mouth went dry instantly. Something about those crude letters made my skin prickle with goosebumps. Beyond the sign, barely visible through the trees, the outline of a cabin took shape. Gray wood and a slanted roof. Windows like vacant eyes staring out at the highway. I told Mike to keep driving. These back roads were notorious for strange occurrences. Everyone in the area had heard rumors, but Mike had always been the curious type, the one who needed to see for himself. He slowed the car, gravel crunching beneath the tires as he pulled onto the shoulder. I argued that whoever needed help would have called emergency services, not painted a sign. Besides, I pointed out, the paint looked fresh, glistening in the fading light, while the cabin appeared long abandoned. My protests fell on deaf ears. Mike insisted we at least check, saying he couldn't live with himself if someone was truly in trouble. The moral high ground, his favorite terrain. The path to the cabin seemed longer than it had appeared from the road. With each step, the air grew colder, despite the warm spring day. Birds had gone silent. Even the insects ceased their constant chorus. Just our footsteps breaking twigs and the hammering of my heart filled the unnatural silence. Up close, the cabin looked both abandoned and recently disturbed. The wooden steps to the porch sagged dangerously, and cobwebs draped the corners of the entryway, yet the door hung slightly ajar, as if recently used. Mike called out, his voice unnaturally loud in the stillness. No response came. Inside, the cabin smelled of mildew and something else, something metallic and organic that made my stomach clench. The floorboards creaked beneath our weight as we moved cautiously through the front room. Dust covered everything, except for a series of footprints that formed a chaotic pattern across the floor, coming from multiple directions. Too many for one person. I noticed it first. Clothes strewn across a chair. Not old and rotted, but modern, clean. A jacket that couldn't have been there more than a day or two. In the small kitchen area, the wood-burning stove radiated faint heat. My fingers trembled as I held them over the warm surface, confirming what I already knew. Whoever had been here had left recently, perhaps minutes ago. Mike seemed oblivious to my growing panic, moving deeper into the cabin, inspecting a collection of old photographs on the wall. Each showed the same thing. The cabin, at different times of year, always with a group of people standing on the porch. In each photo, their faces had been scratched out with something sharp. A sound from upstairs, the subtle shift of weight on old floorboards, sent ice through my veins. My breath caught in my throat as I grabbed Mike's arm, pointing wordlessly toward the ceiling, His eyes widened as the sound came again, deliberate footsteps moving across the room above us. We backed toward the door, moving with agonizing slowness to avoid creaking boards. My heart thundered so loudly I was certain it would give us away. As we reached the threshold, a cold draft swept down the narrow staircase, carrying with it the faint sound of breathing, not human breathing, but something raspier, more deliberate. From the safety of the yard, I looked back at the cabin. My blood froze in my veins. In the upstairs window, partially hidden by a tattered curtain, stood a figure, not moving, just watching. Its form was human-shaped but somehow wrong, too thin, too angular. I couldn't make out a face, just a darker shadow where features should have been. When I blinked, it disappeared. We ran then, abandoning all pretense of courage. The forest seemed to close in around us, branches reaching like grasping hands. By the time we reached the car, my lungs burned and sweat soaked my shirt, despite the chill that had settled over me. Later, at a convenience store 20 miles down the road, we learned the truth. The clerk's face paled when we mentioned the cabin. He told us about the robberies, violent incidents targeting travelers on that isolated stretch of highway. The thieves were clever, he explained, setting up scenarios that appealed to people's better nature. A stranded motorist, a lost hiker, a cabin with a plea for help. He showed us newspaper clippings taped behind the counter. The stories described survivors who had narrowly escaped, people who had grown suspicious before the trap fully closed. Many victims were found days later, wandering the woods with no memory of what had happened to them, valuables gone, exhibiting strange behavior that never quite resolved. Some returned to normal lives, but would wake screaming about figures watching them from windows. What troubled me most wasn't the scheme itself, but the inconsistencies in our experience. The clerk described a group of men who perpetrated these crimes, ordinary criminals exploiting the kindness of strangers. But what we saw, what I saw, in that upstairs window wasn't ordinary. The police reports mentioned nothing about the scratched-out photographs or the otherworldly presence I'd felt. That night at the motel, unable to sleep, I examined the photos I'd taken of the cabin's exterior on my phone. I hadn't noticed it at the time, too occupied with our escape, but there it was, in the upper window, not the vague shadow I remembered seeing, but clearly visible, a gaunt, pale face with eyes like empty sockets, staring directly at the camera. And beside it, another face, and another, at least 5 distinct figures crowded at that single window. Yet what truly sends shivers through me, even now months later, isn't the memory of those faces. It's the realization that came when I zoomed in on the help needed sign. Behind the fresh red paint, barely visible, were older layers of the same message, written in different hands, as if each new victim had been forced to create the lure for the next. I never showed Mike the photo. He's moved on, chalking up our experience to a close call with ordinary criminals. But I know different. Whatever inhabits that cabin isn't just looking for valuables. It's collecting something else entirely. Sometimes I wake in the night, certain I hear scratching at my window, and in my dreams, I'm back at that cabin, painting a sign in red, my face already beginning to fade from my own memory. The first time it happened, I dismissed it as coincidence. The second time, I called it luck. By the third time, a cold dread had settled in my bones, a feeling that would become all too familiar in the months that followed. His name was Julio, and he knew things he shouldn't know, appeared where he shouldn't be, and somehow managed to crawl into the darkest corners of our minds. We learned quickly not to speak his name aloud, not because of some childish superstition, but because of what we'd seen. Because sometimes, when you speak of the devil, he appears. Senior year was supposed to be uneventful, a final stretch before college and the real world. When Julio transferred to Westlake High in October, he was just another face in the hallway, lanky with dark eyes that seemed to look through you rather than at you. He spoke softly, almost in whispers, and kept to himself mostly. Nothing particularly unusual about him, except perhaps how he would sometimes stop mid-sentence and stare into nothing, as if listening to a distant voice only he could hear. The incident with Mark Richardson's broken arm was what first caught our attention. During lunch, Julio approached our table uninvited and suggested Mark shouldn't go to basketball practice that afternoon. He mentioned something about a fall and a hospital visit. Mark laughed it off, telling him to mind his own business. 3 hours later, I watched from the bleachers as Mark landed awkwardly after a rebound, his arm twisting at an impossible angle beneath him. What disturbed me most wasn't the injury itself, but finding Julio standing silently at the gym entrance, his expression not one of shock or concern, but of quiet confirmation. That night, my phone lit up with messages from our friend group, Lucas, Danny, and Sarah, all asking the same question. How did he know? We agreed it was probably just a lucky guess. Basketball injuries happen all the time. Then came the cafeteria fire, small, contained, but frightening nonetheless. The short circuit in the kitchen happened during a crowded lunch period, sending students scrambling for the exits amid the shriek of fire alarms. In the chaos, I found myself pushed against the wall near the emergency exit. That's when I noticed Julio calmly retrieving his backpack from beneath a table, having apparently abandoned his lunch several minutes before the first wisp of smoke appeared. According to Danny, who had been sitting nearby, he had whispered something about smelling smoke long before anyone else noticed anything wrong. The incidents multiplied. Sarah's car accident, minor, thankfully, that Julio had warned her about the day before. The sudden cancellation of a physics exam due to the teacher's emergency, announced moments after Julio had told Lucas not to bother studying for it. We started watching him, documenting the predictions in a shared document. Some were vague enough to be dismissed. Others were disturbingly specific. One thing became clear. Julio was either psychic or orchestrating events himself. The question of which possibility was more terrifying consumed our thoughts. It was Lucas who first suggested setting a trap. We would fabricate a crisis, a controlled situation where we could test whether Julio was causing these incidents or merely predicting them. We chose the chemistry lab after hours, setting up what would appear to be a dangerous, but ultimately harmless chemical reaction. Only the four of us would know it was staged. The plan was set for Friday afternoon. Sarah would pretend to stay late to complete an assignment, while I would hide in the storage closet, watching. Lucas and Danny would monitor the hallways, tracking Julio's movements. Friday came, and a strange heaviness hung in the air. My skin prickled with a constant sensation of being watched. Twice I caught myself checking over my shoulder in empty corridors. During last period, my phone buzzed with a message from Danny. Don't say his name. I stared at those words, a cold sweat breaking across my forehead. That morning, we had carefully avoided mentioning Julio aloud, communicating only through messages about the subject. Somehow, Danny had sensed my thoughts drifting toward him. After the final bell, I made my way to the chemistry lab, slipping into the storage closet while the hallways were still crowded. Sarah arrived 20 minutes later, setting up her staged experiment. The minutes ticked by, thick and sluggish. The school grew quiet as clubs ended and sports practices wrapped up. The only sounds were the occasional distant slam of a locker and Sarah's deliberate movements as she arranged beakers and test tubes. At 5:17 p.m., my phone vibrated. A message from Lucas. No sign of him. Left school at 3:30 according to security guard. Relief and disappointment mingled in my chest. Perhaps our test would prove nothing after all. Then came the soft click of the lab door. From my vantage point through the slitted ventilation of the closet door, I saw Sarah freeze, her back to the entrance. She turned slowly, and though I couldn't see her face, I felt her fear in the rigid line of her shoulders. "You shouldn't be here," said a soft voice, Julio's voice. I saw what happens. My heart thundered against my ribs so violently, I feared he might hear it. Sarah stammered something about finishing an assignment. Julio moved further into the room, slowly circling the lab table where she stood. "There's no assignment," he stated flatly. "You're trying to test me. All of you are." My breath caught in my throat. How could he possibly know? "Where are the others?" he asked, his voice eerily calm. Sarah denied anyone else was involved, but Julio continued as if she hadn't spoken. "He's in the closet, isn't he? And the other two are somewhere nearby." The temperature in the small storage space seemed to drop 20 degrees, my muscles locked in place, unable to move as panic flooded my system. "You think I'm causing these things?" Julio continued, now directly facing the closet door, his eyes seemingly finding mine through the wood and metal. "But I'm not. I just see them before they happen, sometimes minutes before, sometimes days." He turned back to Sarah. "I came to warn you. Whatever you've planned here, stop it. I saw something else, something worse." The fluorescent lights overhead flickered suddenly, casting the room in momentary darkness. When they stabilized, Julio was standing beside the door. "Don't try to understand it," he said quietly. "I don't. But please believe me when I tell you that you're playing with something dangerous. There are rules I don't fully comprehend myself." He paused, hand on the doorknob. "And one more thing. When you speak my name, I can hear it. No matter where I am, it pulls me toward the danger like gravity." The door opened and he added, "That's why I'm always there when bad things happen. Someone says my name and the visions come. Then I have no choice but to follow." After he left, I emerged from the closet, legs trembling beneath me. Sarah stood motionless, pale and shaking. We called off the experiment immediately, texting Lucas and Danny to meet us at my house. That night, as we huddled in my garage trying to make sense of what had happened, a strange consensus formed without any of us explicitly stating it. We believed him. Not because we wanted to, but because the alternative, that he was somehow causing these events, seemed increasingly implausible given the scope and nature of the incidents. We made a pact that night. We would never speak Julio's name aloud again. We would keep our distance, document everything, but never interfere. Most importantly, we would tell no one else what we suspected. 2 weeks later, Julio transferred out of Westlake High as abruptly as he had arrived. The official explanation was that his family was moving again. His father's job required frequent relocations. I still find myself checking the shadows when accidents happen, half expecting to see his lanky silhouette watching from a distance. Sometimes, when I'm alone and the silence grows too heavy, I wonder if speaking his name would summon him across whatever distance now separates us. But I never test that theory. Some questions are better left unanswered, some names better left unspoken. Because I can't shake the feeling that Julio wasn't the harbinger of those incidents. We were, every time we said his name. The nightmares began the night after Professor Moda's art workshop. Something about the way his eyes lingered on my sketches, how his crooked fingers traced the contours of my drawings with unusual fascination. I remember his whisper, "You have the sight. The rare ones always do." I dismissed it then. 3 weeks later, I haven't slept properly since. My name is Daniel Harper. I'm 34, rational, and employed as an architectural consultant. I've never believed in the supernatural, never given credence to paranormal phenomena. Yet here I am, at 3:17 a.m., drenched in cold sweat, afraid to close my eyes again. The nightmares have become more than dreams. They've become visitations. That first night after the workshop, I dreamed of a twisted corridor lined with doors that breathed like lungs. Behind each door, something waited, something that knew my name. I woke gasping, my heart hammering against my ribs as if trying to escape. The dream faded quickly, as dreams do, leaving only fragments. The color of rust, the smell of wet soil, a sensation of falling. The following day, during our second workshop session, Professor Moda approached my desk. He asked about my sleep, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, his smile too wide for comfort. My mouth went dry when he inquired specifically about corridors and doors. I hadn't told anyone about my dream. The hair on my arms stood on end as he nodded at my silence, as if confirming something to himself. The second nightmare featured a gallery of distorted mirrors. In each reflection, my face appeared slightly wrong. Eyes too far apart, mouth stretched into impossible shapes. In the final mirror, my reflection wasn't me at all, but a figure composed of swirling black ink that reached toward the glass. I jolted awake, throat raw. I must have been screaming. Professor Moda knew about the mirrors too. He inquired about them before class, his voice casual, but his eyes intense and hungry. He wondered if I had seen the ink man yet. My blood ran cold. I asked how he could possibly know the contents of my dreams. He merely smiled and said that certain minds were receptive canvases. According to him, I was specially attuned to frequencies others couldn't perceive. I should have quit the workshop then. Instead, curiosity drew me deeper. After the third session, I lingered behind, watching as Moda packed his supplies. When he stepped out briefly, I noticed a worn, leather-bound notebook beneath his portfolio. Something compelled me to look. My fingers trembled as I flipped through pages filled with illustrations, precise, detailed renderings of my nightmares. The breathing doors, the distorted mirrors, creatures and landscapes I had dreamed but couldn't fully remember upon waking. The final pages showed scenes I hadn't yet dreamed, scenes that made my stomach clench with dread. Moda returned before I could replace the notebook. His expression darkened momentarily before smoothing into that too-wide smile. He claimed the sketches were merely artistic explorations, coincidental similarities. The tremor in his left hand betrayed his lie. I tried explaining my concerns to my girlfriend, Sarah. She attributed my anxiety to work stress and the sleeping pills I'd recently started taking. When I mentioned Moda's strange questions in the notebook, she reminded me that artists were often eccentric. She suggested I was experiencing the power of suggestion, Moda's imagery influencing my subconscious mind. Her rational explanations should have comforted me. They didn't. The nightmares intensified. Each night, I descended deeper into landscapes of impossible geometry and lurking presences. Each morning, dark circles beneath my eyes grew more pronounced, My hands developed a perpetual tremor. Colleagues at work began avoiding me, exchanging concerned glances when they thought I wasn't looking. During the fifth workshop, Mota lectured about ancient beliefs regarding dreams as gateways between worlds. Throughout history, he explained, certain individuals served as conduits, their minds like doors that could be opened. Some cultures worshipped these people, others feared them. Throughout his lecture, his gaze repeatedly returned to me, his pupils so dilated they nearly swallowed the iris. After that class, I drove to the university's art department and requested information about Professor Mota. The administrator's expression changed subtly when I mentioned his name. She informed me that no one by that name was officially employed there. When I described him, she grew pale and ended our conversation abruptly. That night, I researched obsessively, hunting for any information about Mota. I found nothing. No social media profiles, no exhibition history, no academic credentials. It was as if he didn't exist outside of that workshop basement. Around 2 a.m., I discovered an obscure blog post mentioning a Professor M who conducted art workshops across the country. The post claimed several participants had subsequently suffered from severe sleep disturbances and altered perceptions. Some had been institutionalized. 2 had vanished entirely. My throat constricted as I read. The screen's blue light cast ghoulish shadows across my apartment walls, shadows that seemed to move independently when viewed from the corner of my eye. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to remain rational. There had to be a logical explanation. Perhaps Mota was slipping hallucinogens into the workshop refreshments, or employing psychological manipulation techniques. I decided not to attend the final workshop session. Instead, I called Sarah, asking if I could stay at her place. Her voicemail answered. I left a message, trying to keep the mounting panic from my voice. I double-checked all windows and doors, then swallowed 2 sleeping pills despite my reservations. I needed rest desperately. That night, my nightmare began differently. I stood in a familiar room, my own bedroom. Everything appeared normal, except for a sketchbook on my desk that wasn't mine. As I approached it, dread pooled in my stomach. The pages contained drawings of me sleeping, rendered in meticulous detail from various angles around my room, perspectives impossible for me to have seen. The final page showed me turning to face my bedroom door, where a figure stood watching. I woke with a violent start. The digital clock read 3:33 a.m. My bedroom lay in perfect darkness except for a thin sliver of moonlight between the curtains. Something felt wrong. The air seemed charged, dense with anticipation. My breath fogged slightly in front of my face despite the summer heat. Then I heard it. Soft breathing that wasn't mine. I lay paralyzed, straining my eyes against the darkness. The rational part of my mind insisted on sleep paralysis, a hallucination brought on by stress and medication. But then the whispering started. The canvas is prepared, a voice murmured from the darkest corner of my room. Mota's voice, but somehow altered, layered with other tones beneath it. The door is open now. Thank you for your contribution. I fumbled for the lamp, fingers clumsy with terror. When light flooded the room, no one was there, but my walls were different. Every inch of surface was covered with drawings identical to those from Mota's notebook. My nightmares rendered in perfect, terrible detail. I haven't seen Professor Mota since that night. The workshop location is now an empty storefront with no record of recent occupancy. The other participants have no recollection of any art instructor matching his description. But the nightmares continue, more vivid than ever, and sometimes In reflective surfaces, windows, mirrors, the black screen of my phone, I glimpse that figure of swirling ink watching me from behind the glass. Waiting. Every morning I discover new drawings in my apartment that I have no memory of creating, depicting scenes of horror I'm yet to dream. I'm no longer certain where the nightmares end and waking begins. The boundaries between worlds have become permeable, thinned by whatever moda awakened in my mind. I feel something taking shape inside me, artist or artwork, I cannot tell. All I know is that I've become the canvas, and whatever is being painted hasn't finished its work.